If you've been following my channel for long, you know how much I absolutely love using my telephoto lens for landscape photography. I even recently got a 200 to 600 millimeter lens, which has already provided quite a few portfolio-worthy shots in just a couple of outings. Now, I thought that it was about time to talk about tips when you're using your telephoto lens, since I've learned quite a lot over the last few years, and I wanted to share how you guys can take better shots with your own telephoto lens. If you're new here, my name is Austin James Jackson. I'm a professional landscape photographer based in the beautiful Utah. Now, as mentioned, we are talking about tips for shooting telephoto landscapes in today's video. If you guys don't already have a telephoto lens, I think you honestly should really pick one up. Now, while landscapes are traditionally known for being shot with an ultra-wide lens, a lot of my best portfolio-worthy shots are actually shot with a telephoto lens where I focused in on a more intimate subject and I used the telephoto to reduce the clutter in the scene. Which leads us perfectly into tip number one, which is all about using your telephoto lens correctly. Use your telephoto lens in order to reduce clutter in your scene and bring some attention to something that's out of the ordinary. A lot of times the best shots are going to feature something interesting or unique, and you can use the zoom on the lens to help reduce the clutter around that particular interesting or unique object. Now let's take the forest for example. Capturing wide-angle scenes in the forest is excruciatingly difficult under most light conditions, and I know that because my clients struggle every year on my Southern Oregon coast workshop where we shoot in California's coastal redwoods. It's so hard to shoot a great wide angle shot because it is such a busy area with all sorts of different plants in different shades, meaning like the color of the plant, not like in sun or shade, but the actual shade of the plant being green or yellow or slightly blue. It's really tough to reduce the clutter. Now, by using your telephoto lens, you can actually cut through a lot of the uninteresting parts of your image, leaving a much more interesting photo in the end. For this reason, I almost exclusively avoid having any sky in my telephoto compositions because it's usually not interesting. And if the sky is interesting, I'm usually going to switch to my wide angle lens anyways to capture more of those interesting clouds or interesting light. Tip number two is just a good photography tip in general, but I find it to be even more important when you're shooting telephoto landscapes. You should always watch the edges of your frame and be sure to avoid having any distracting objects that'll draw your viewer's eye away from the subject of the photo. Ideally, you'd be able to zoom in far enough that the edges of your frame remain clean or free from distractions. Now, when that isn't possible, you can always go back through and you can spot heal the distracting parts of the image. Now, either way, you should always make sure to leave the edges of the frame clean for the most compelling photos, in my personal opinion. You absolutely don't want any highly detailed object exiting the frame on any side when at all possible. Tip number three is to follow the light. Again, another great photography tip in general, but especially for telephoto shots. The best time for shooting telephoto images is similar to when you'd want to shoot regular landscape wide angle images, which is going to be sunset, sunrise, or during the daytime on a day with broken clouds, which really is just a great time for the telephoto lens. Now, I'm pretty amazed at how easily you can find intriguing compositions in the middle of the day when the sun's peeking in and out of the clouds. One of the nice things about shooting with a telephoto as opposed to a normal wide-angle lens is how easy it is to frame out an intriguing photo. Since you're shooting up close and personal with your subject, you don't necessarily have to find a compelling foreground like you do with a wide angle, so really just about anywhere with a good view of the landscape will work. As the light continues to move, you can simply follow the light with your camera, oftentimes sticking in the same spot, all while capturing great photos as the light continues to move. If possible, you should visit a very scenic location on a day with broken clouds or visit just after sunrise or before sunset. Get to an overlook if at all possible and follow the light. For this reason, a lot of you guys may have been here before, but for me personally, I love Bryce Canyon, especially on those winter days after a fresh snow. Now, I'm really lucky to live close to the park, and in the particular park of Bryce Canyon, you can drive and park right along the rim, allowing you to look down at the many interesting bunches of hoodoos. It's so easy to get great telephoto shots here when the light hits just right, since you're looking at so much variety in the landscape and you're shooting downwards as the light moves across the scene. So you can literally just stand on the rim with your telephoto lens and cherry pick great images just while walking 10 minutes or less from your car. Now, before we move into tip number 4, I do want to mention to be sure that you're subscribed to my channel. And if you're not, do that right now. If you're a photographer, I post videos every single week with the simple goal of helping you to take better photos. So be sure to subscribe if you want to see every video and become a better photographer. Now, tip number 4 is to use negative space to your advantage. Many landscape photographers, myself included, seem to, or at least I used to think that more is better, when in fact, in my opinion now, more is actually worse and less is better. For me, the most appealing images are the ones that are simple yet powerful. Photos with too much going on, like a great sunset, foreground, flowers, midground, trees, a model in the frame, and every other possible distracting element under the sun might feel better because there's more going on, but it's actually worse because this just increases the clutter and distraction in your photo. Even without being in a very scenic area, you can pretty easily use negative space to create compelling images with your telephoto lens. Take this image, for example, where I was hiking to a cinder cone that had a few of these small pine trees growing out of the side of it on like the rocks, like the volcanic rock. I made sure to get to the right angle and zoom in to avoid having any sky in my frame. And then I simply just included the trees in the photo. In my opinion, the negative space is powerful to show the resilience of the trees and how remote it felt as I was shooting the image. Now, while I could have captured the same subject with more zoom, I think that zooming out actually gave me more negative space, which made my subject smaller. And since I didn't add any distracting elements as I zoomed out, it helped the image to appear even more grand, in my opinion, by adding a little sense of scale. Now, once you learn to use your telephoto lens, you're going to begin to see that negative space exists everywhere in the natural world. Simply find an interesting and isolated subject and then find the best angle to capture it with a low detailed negative space in the background. Tip number 5 is going to be to use compression. This is a technique that many beginners and even amateur photographers either don't know about or they don't understand how it works. But if you really want to take great photos, compression is a huge thing that you need to understand. Sometimes capturing the best image will require you to back up and zoom in. For many, this concept doesn't really make sense because you would think that zooming in would just negate what you did by backing up. This is totally wrong. Now, while it may keep your subject that's close to you roughly the same size, what you're going to do is increase the size of the background. This can help you to take boring blue sky out of your image, and instead you'll be able to capture more of whatever it is that's interesting in your scene. This is a great technique to use regardless of what you're shooting with your telephoto, and it really ties back into many of the other tips mentioned. By backing up and zooming in further, your subject might look the same, but you can cut through a lot of the clutter that might be distracting in your image. If this concept still doesn't make sense to you, grab your camera and telephoto lens, take a photo of something outdoors with something else in the background of your subject. Then move away from the subject and try to frame out the same shot by zooming in. You're going to quickly notice how the background changes and will fill up more of the frame. This concept also works to create a sense of scale in your photos. If you're shooting something that is close enough to walk to, consider backing up and zooming in to create a sense of scale in your image. Of course, to create scale, you'll need to have something like a person or another object in the frame, but you guys get the point. Now, tip number 6 is to use leading lines. Wide-angle shots aren't the only ones that can have leading lines. Consider how you can use the objects in your frame to layer or overlap, creating more depth in your scene. Since you're using a telephoto, spotting these great lines to photograph takes patience and a good eye, but it's actually much easier than finding a grand landscape with a perfect scene and leading lines and an interesting subject. Many of the same composition rules apply for telephoto landscapes as they do for wide-angle landscapes, so be sure to keep this in mind when you're shooting with your telephoto, and of course, don't be afraid to break the rules when the opportunity is right. Now, tip number 7 is a post-processing trick. Had to throw one in there for you guys. Since you're zooming in to take a telephoto shot, a lot of times it's challenging to show off depth in your scene, especially if the objects you're photographing are close together. You might need to do some additional work when post-processing in order to accentuate depth in your scene. My favorite way to do this is by adding or removing haze or brightness from different parts of the scene. When objects overlap, they can appear to look like one object if you don't separate them somehow. Regardless of the software you use for photo editing, there's hopefully an easy way to make local adjustments. If you're using Lightroom or Photoshop or On1 or Luminar or anything like that. DxO, any of those that I've listed, of course, have really easy ways to make local adjustments. I recommend trying to make good selections of different objects in your images, and then slightly increasing or decreasing the exposure to pull the two objects apart. Now take this image, for example, where I was able to adjust the luminosity and hue of the different hills in order to add depth to the scene. Now, that's my 7 tips for better telephoto landscapes that I think is going to help you to improve your landscape photography. If you have any tips of your own, let me know down below in the comments. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions that you may have as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to help me to continue to grow my channel to make you a better photographer. We'll see you guys next time.